Anxiety is not fear of the future. It's brutal rejection of the present. It's waking up with clenched teeth and an invisible weight on your chest, as if your nervous system has been preparing for a battle that never arrives. It's the need to control every detail because deep down, something in you is screaming, if I don't predict it, I won't survive it. You don't call it that. You call it being organized, being cautious, being realistic. But behind all your to-do lists, contingency plans, and imagined conversations, there's a silent terror. The kind that doesn't shout. It just hums constantly. The kind that says, I can't bear to be here, right now, with this. Living in the present feels like walking barefoot over emotional shards of glass. You try to stand still, but it cuts. So you keep moving, planning, projecting, running forward in your mind because the now is too raw, too real. And maybe no one ever told you this, but your obsession with the future is not hope, it's panic. The mind doesn't predict because it dreams. It predicts because it's scared. Because if you can predict, then maybe you won't fall. If you can control, then maybe you won't be abandoned. If you can script it all in advance, maybe, just maybe, you'll feel safe. That's the lie. If I can predict everything, I'll be safe. But that safety, it became your prison. Because now you're not really living, you're calculating. You're not present, you're preparing. You're not free, you're forecasting. Schopenhauer once said, life swings like a pendulum between pain and boredom, and maybe your pendulum broke. Maybe now you swing only between anxiety and avoidance. You check your phone, again. Not to find anything, but to escape what's already here. You plan your day, you tweak your future, you visualize outcomes, but not because they fulfill you. Because the silence of the present makes your skin crawl. And the worst part, it works. Planning works temporarily, it numbs the ache. But it also distances you from yourself. What if your addiction to planning is just fear of feeling? The fear of living without control, the secret origin of compulsive forecasting. There was a time, maybe in childhood, maybe in a moment you don't speak of, when something shattered and no one noticed. You kept walking. But from that day forward, uncertainty was no longer neutral. It became dangerous, and since then, your mind learned something cruelly brilliant. If it could predict everything, it would never feel that pain again. So it started forecasting every possible outcome, every subtle change in tone, every look, every silence. It wrote 1,000 futures every hour, not because it's imaginative, but because it's terrified. A traumatized mind doesn't perceive ambiguity as possibility. It sees it as a threat. If you don't know what's coming, then anything could happen, and anything to you means danger. So now you don't live your life. You pre-live it. You simulate conversations. You prepare for betrayal. You anticipate loss. You run through emotional rehearsals as if the present were just a waiting room for disaster. You don't want to live the present. You want to survive it. You want to pass through this day without pain, without surprise, without exposure. And so the mind becomes a factory of predictions. It writes preemptive endings, scripts arguments before they start, invents problems to solve. Because solving something, even if imaginary, feels safer than being with what is. The paradox is devastating. You believe you're preparing for the worst, but what you're really doing is refusing to feel the now. Your obsession with the future isn't a goal, it's armor. And every time you wear it, you reinforce the same silent story. The present is not a place I can stay. But what if that belief is the very thing keeping you from healing? The invisible screenwriter syndrome. When your mind writes futures that never happen, there's a voice in your head that never stops drafting scripts. It's not loud, it's precise. It imagines scenes before they unfold, dangers before they exist, losses before they arrive. It builds futures, not to inspire you, but to warn you. You could be sitting in silence and suddenly you're arguing with someone in your mind. You're preparing for a betrayal that hasn't happened. You're grieving something that never even began. This voice isn't evil, it's scared. It writes stories because it doesn't trust life to write them for you. It wants a guarantee, so it invents one. But here's the trap. Every time you believe one of these scripts, you reinforce the idea that your fear is prophecy. You stop moving, you hesitate, you withdraw. Not because reality hurt you, but because your imagined future already did. You begin to live inside simulations. Your mind becomes a projector and your body just a seat in the audience. You watch, you flinch, you prepare, but you don't act, you don't engage, you don't risk. And slowly, without noticing, you build a life inside your head and abandon the one outside of it. This is the invisible screenwriter. It doesn't write for truth, it writes for control. It builds catastrophes not to destroy you, but to keep you alert, to keep you safe, to keep you locked in. But safety that costs your freedom is just another kind of cage. And maybe what you fear isn't the future itself, but the terrifying, uncontrollable truth that the future can't be rehearsed, only lived. And that living requires stepping into the unscripted. The paradox of anticipation. The more you predict, the less you live. You tell yourself you're preparing, that all this thinking, this overthinking, this imagining is useful, that it's the responsible thing to do. But behind every scenario you plan, there's a silent bargain. I'll give up the now for the illusion of control later. And it is an illusion, because later never really arrives. It only morphs into a new version of soon. You live as if life begins after the next solution, once the job is secured, once the body changes, once the relationship feels certain, once the fear dissolves. But that once is a ghost. You chase it through months, through years, through sleepless nights. And every time you reach for it, it moves one step further, because your mind, trained in anticipation, doesn't know how to stop. It's conditioned to postpone, to delay presence, to exchange experience for expectation. And what gets lost isn't just time, it's intimacy, connection, joy. You stop tasting food, you stop hearing your own breath. You miss glances, sunsets, even your own quiet victories, because you're always elsewhere. Pleasure becomes a project, happiness a future event, peace a pending task. And while your mind negotiates the future, life happens, unwitnessed, unfelt. You're not behind, you're not broken. But maybe you're living inside a mental postponement that's disguised itself as preparation. And maybe the price of prediction is presence. The dopaminergic illusion, how anticipation became your invisible addiction. There's a strange high that comes from almost solving, almost arriving, almost becoming. The brain rewards it, not with fulfillment, but with the chemical shadow of it. Dopamine doesn't wait for the result. It fires at the image, at the fantasy, at the plan. You feel alive when imagining the change, when visualizing the outcome, when crafting the perfect timeline of who you could become. But the moment you face the actual step, the raw, imperfect, unfiltered action, the thrill dissolves. And all that's left is discomfort, because fantasy is clean, reality isn't. And somewhere deep in your wiring, your brain started to prefer the simulation, to seek the high of preparation rather than the slow friction of progress. You start new plans, not to finish them, but to feel that early spark again. You create endless strategies, not to implement them, but to avoid the void that appears when there's nothing left to dream. And so it loops. You become addicted to the blueprint, to the rush of potential, to the sensation of change without the burden of transformation. It's not laziness, it's neurochemical survival. Your mind learned to chase the next plan to escape the present moment. Not because the present is wrong, but because the now doesn't come with the dopamine hit of what could be. You're not unmotivated. You're overstimulated by illusions and exhausted from confusing excitement with movement. You've been high on prediction and numb to reality. But maybe the only way back to yourself is through the uncomfortable silence that happens when the fantasy ends and the real work begins. The false identity of the planner, when prediction gives you a sense of value. Somewhere along the path of survival, planning became your identity. Not just a habit, a persona, a shield made of calendars and clarity, a self-image built around being on top of things, even when internally everything felt like collapse. You feel competent when you plan. You feel intelligent, reliable, even admirable, because being organized is the closest thing to being in control. And control, for you, feels like the only way to matter. Without a plan, you fear becoming invisible. A ghost, another drifting mind in a world that only respects outcomes. So you keep building strategies, goals, deadlines, not because you love the process, but because they quiet the deeper fear. If I stop structuring, I'll disappear. There's an emptiness you've never named, and planning covers it. Just enough, just well enough to keep moving without asking, who am I if I'm not progressing? Because if you're not optimizing, you're wasting time. If you're not advancing, you're falling behind. If you're not prepared, you're vulnerable, and vulnerability, in your internal dictionary, reads as shame. So the planner becomes your mask, and the mask becomes your worth. But what if that worth was never meant to be earned through systems? What if your value is not in your vision boards or your weekly goals, but in your capacity to feel, to be present, to exist without a performance? You're not just the plans you make. You're the one who's afraid of being without them, and in that fear, you've already revealed something far more human than any strategy ever could. The shock of presence, the inner war between living and narrating. There's a silence you've avoided for years, not because it's empty, but because it's too full. The moment you stop projecting into the future, the noise starts. Not external noise, internal. The kind that creeps in when the mind has nothing left to control. So you keep moving. Not forward, just away. Away from stillness, away from the aching pulse of presence, because to be truly present is not peaceful. It's raw. It's 3 minutes staring at a wall and realizing you don't know who you are without plans. It's watching your own thoughts claw for meaning, for structure, for something to fix. It's feeling the anxiety crawl up your spine when nothing's scheduled, nothing's forecasted, nothing's coming. But in that moment, when you don't follow the thought, when you don't escape the discomfort, when you just stay, something breaks. And in that breaking, something ancient wakes up. The part of you that doesn't need to narrate life to live it. The part that doesn't strategize feelings. The part that doesn't edit the moment before accepting it. You begin to see what the mind's been protecting you from. Not pain, but intimacy. Not chaos, but contact. Because to be here, truly here, means you'll have to feel what the future was built to avoid. Presence is a shock, because it strips you of your illusions. It forces you into direct contact with what's unresolved, and that feels like war. But beneath that war, there's something the screenwriter in your head will never give you. A moment of real life, unscripted, unfiltered, undeniably yours. When predicting the worst is your way of avoiding love. Did you enjoy the content and it made a difference for you? Click on Super Thanks and support our work. You become so skilled at seeing the storm coming that you forgot how to stand in the sunlight. Affection feels like exposure, desire feels like danger, and connection, real, unfiltered connection, feels like walking into a battlefield without armor. So you predict abandonment, you predict betrayal, you predict the silence that follows intimacy like a shadow. Because if you expect the worst, you can't be caught off guard. If you write the tragedy in advance, At least you won't be surprised when the curtain falls. But here's the truth no one taught you. You don't sabotage love because you hate it. You sabotage it because it requires presence. And presence is the one thing your mind still doesn't trust. Being here with someone, letting them see the part of you that isn't edited, curated, or managed. Letting them hear the tremble in your voice, the silence between your words, the unfinished sentence of who you are. That's the real terror. So instead, you forecast collapse. You build ruins in your imagination to avoid the risk of building something real. You say you're protecting yourself, but really, you're hiding from the possibility of being known, of being touched without strategy, of being loved, not for what you plan to become, but for what you already are. And maybe that's the most terrifying future of all. Not the one where everything goes wrong, but the one where something finally goes right, and you have no idea how to receive it. The antidote is not prediction, it's endurance. The pain isn't in what might happen, it's in what's already happening, and you keep refusing to feel it. You keep projecting ahead because looking inward would mean confronting the wound that never fully closed. You fear the collapse of a future that never arrived, but what's bleeding is the present you keep abandoning. There's a silent ache beneath all your plans, a memory you never processed, a need you never named, a grief you never gave permission to speak. And so the mind runs, faster, further, crafting one more version of control, one more imagined escape, because it believes the pain will disappear if you just stay one step ahead. But the truth is simpler and heavier. The only way out is through the ache, through the stillness, through the part of you that no longer wants a solution, just space to feel. Returning to the present isn't poetic, it's brutal, because it strips away every fantasy you used to survive. It demands that you stand in front of life with nothing but your raw self, unpredicted, unscripted, unguarded. And that's not weakness, that's strength, the kind of strength that doesn't shine, it endures. Schopenhauer once wrote, "A man can do what he wills, but he cannot will what he wills." Maybe that's the paradox you're caught in. You want peace, but your mind isn't trained to rest. You want presence, but your heart still bristles at stillness. You want to exist, but everything in you has been taught to prepare instead. But existence doesn't require preparation. It requires presence. And freedom doesn't come from knowing what's next. It comes from finally accepting that you don't need to. You don't need to predict to exist. You need to feel, to be free. The truth you've postponed for years. There's a version of you waiting in the silence, not to be discovered, but to be felt. You've spent so much time calculating who you should become that you forgot the weight of who you already are. Not the curated self, not the productive self, not the one who always knows what's next, but the unfinished one. The one who aches without words, the one who fears stillness not because it's empty, but because it's too honest. You tried to outrun the now, with schedules, with dreams, with fear disguised as foresight. But the present never stopped calling. It waited, in quiet moments, in broken plans, in those nights when even your distractions failed to protect you. It waited, not to punish, but to reveal that the pain you've been trying to predict your way out of was never in the future. It was here. In your chest, in your breath, in the absence you didn't name. There's no ending to this story that will save you. There's only this moment, brutal, unfiltered, sacred, and in that moment, no plan will protect you, no strategy will define you, no thought will complete you, only presence, only the trembling courage to remain, to witness yourself without running, without rewriting, because in the end, you don't find peace by solving life. You find it when you finally stop needing to. You don't need to predict to exist. You need to feel to be free.